My name is Emily, and at 31 years old, I have spent the last decade as an active-duty Air Force logistics officer managing multimillion-dollar supply chains across 3 continents. Yet to my older sister Melissa, I am nothing more than an unpaid, glorified convenience. I stood in the foyer of her impeccably curated 5-bedroom colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, feeling the gritty residue of a cross-country flight from Travis Air Force Base on my skin, while she adjusted her designer sunglasses and checked her reflection in the gilded entryway mirror. "You are a lifesaver, Emily," she said, her voice carrying that specific tone of performative gratitude that actually functioned as a command. "The kids' schedule is on the fridge, and we have already installed the car seats in the 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLS 580, so try not to mess up their routine while we are at the beach." There was no hug, no inquiry about my 4-hour layover in Denver, and certainly no acknowledgement of the fact that I had burned my only 14 days of mid-tour leave to fly 2,800 miles because she had sobbed on the phone about a supposed family emergency that turned out to be a last-minute luxury getaway to the Maldives with her husband, Bradley. The air in the house smelled of expensive Jo Malone sea salt candles and a subtle undercurrent of bleach, a sharp contrast to the hydraulic fluid and burnt jet fuel that usually defined my workspace. Melissa, who is 34 and has never held a job more taxing than coordinating the local country club's gala committee, handed me a sleek, leather-bound planner as if she were passing off a classified dossier. Everything is in there, from the exact brand of organic, non-GMO almond butter Leo requires for his crustless sandwiches to the precise 6:45 p.m. timing for Sophia's Mandarin immersion app, she continued, her heels clicking against the polished white oak floors as she moved toward the door where 2 sets of Tumi hardshell luggage were already waiting. I looked down at my own scuffed tactical boots and felt the familiar simmering resentment that comes from being the reliable sibling in a family that treats reliability as a weakness to be exploited. I had arrived expecting a crisis, perhaps something involving our aging parents or a genuine health scare, but instead I was greeted with a set of keys and a list of chores that included walking their high-strung golden doodle and ensuring the lawn irrigation system didn't overwater the $15,000 worth of new landscaping. My sister's life was a meticulously constructed monument to excess, financed by Bradley's partnership at a top-tier private equity firm, while my life was measured in duty cycles and government-issued housing. As I watched her climb into the waiting black Cadillac Escalade that would whisk them to JFK, I realized that to her, my military service was just a convenient gap in my schedule that allowed me to be her on-call servant. She didn't see the logistics officer who coordinated the movement of heavy armor and personnel through hostile territory. She saw the little sister who used to fold her laundry for an extra $5 a week. I walked into the kitchen, the silence of the massive house settling around me like a heavy fog, and looked at the schedule magnet to the Sub-Zero refrigerator. It was a grid of micromanaged insanity, detailing every minute of her children's lives with the clinical precision of a flight manifest. I pulled out a stool, the leather cool against my jeans, and thought about the $1,200 I had spent on a last-minute commercial ticket because the military transport flight I had hoped for was grounded. Melissa hadn't even offered to reimburse me, assuming that my military salary, which barely cleared $85,000 a year after 10 years of service, was more than enough for such trifles. I reached for my phone, checking the time, and felt the sudden jarring realization that my gift of a vacation was actually a 2-week sentence in a gilded cage. I was 31, single, and exhausted from a year of 12-hour shifts, yet here I was, preparing to manage a household that cost more in monthly property taxes than I made in 3 months, all because I couldn't say no to the sister who had spent her entire life making sure I knew my place was beneath her. The sun began to set over the manicured hedges of the backyard, casting long, jagged shadows across the marble countertops, and for the first time in my career, I felt completely and utterly defeated by a mission I never signed up for. The contrast between our lives is a jagged glass edge that I have learned to walk on with the practiced precision of a soldier, though today it feels like it is finally drawing blood. For the last 3 years I have lived out of a deployment bag, surviving on $14 case Amory's, the ones where the vegetable crumbles taste like wet cardboard and the electrolyte powder never quite dissolves, while sleeping in corrugated metal hangars where the scream of jet engines at 3 o'clock is the only lullaby I know. I have meticulously saved every cent of my $5,600 monthly base pay, living like a monk in a desert to ensure there was always a financial safety net for a family that uses me as a human ATM. Meanwhile, Melissa parades through her 3,200 square foot suburban fortress in Greenwich, A house with a $4,200 monthly mortgage that she and Bradley can barely afford despite their frantic efforts to project an image of effortless wealth. She floats through the house in $210 Lululemon Align sets, her skin glowing from monthly $300 hydrofacials, while I stand in her designer kitchen wearing my government-issued Danner Tachyon boots, feeling like an intruder in a world built on debt and artifice. My parents, who view the world through a lens of fragile middle-class aspirations, treat Melissa like a delicate porcelain queen whose slightest inconvenience is a national tragedy, while I am relegated to the role of a free high-end concierge service with no off switch. When Melissa's central air conditioning unit sputtered last July, my father called me in a panic, implying it was my duty to wire her $2,000 for the emergency repair because I didn't have any real expenses out in the field. They see my military service not as a sacrifice of my youth and safety, but as a convenient source of liquid capital and a logistical solution to their favorite daughter's poor planning. As I stood by her Sub-Zero refrigerator, which likely cost more than my first car, I realized the sheer weight of the injustice. I have spent a decade managing complex supply lines for the United States Air Force, ensuring that millions of dollars in equipment reach their destination through active war zones, yet here I was being lectured on the proper way to rinse a Vitamix blender. The inequality isn't just in the bank accounts. It is in the very marrow of how we are perceived. My mother once told me that I was strong enough to handle anything, a compliment that I eventually realized was actually an excuse to never offer me help. Because I can survive a desert sandstorm or a logistics nightmare at a transit hub, they assume I don't need a soft place to land, whereas Melissa's life is a constant series of soft landings provided by everyone else's hard work. I looked out the window at her manicured lawn, the irrigation heads popping up to spray treated water over $15,000 of fresh sod, and thought about the 5-gallon solar showers I used to cherish. The unfairness of it all hummed in my chest like a low-frequency vibration, the realization that no matter how many ranks I achieve or how much of the world I secure, I will always be the secondary character in the epic saga of Melissa's domestic drama. I am the one who pays the bills, the one who shows up when the pipes burst, and the one who flies across the country to babysit so she can sip cocktails in the Maldives. Yet I am the only one in this family who truly knows what it means to be alone in a crowded room. Every luxury she possesses feels like a tax on my soul, a physical manifestation of the years I spent in the heat and the dust while she was picking out the perfect shade of eggshell white for a nursery she expected me to help fund. The silence of the house was deafening, a vacuum where my own needs and identity were sucked away to make room for her endless, exhausting requirements. The betrayal hit with the force of a kinetic strike at exactly 7:14 p.m. while I was standing in the clinical silence of Melissa's designer kitchen. I had been looking for a spare set of AA batteries for the high-tech baby monitor when I opened a drawer in the kitchen island, only to find a manila folder labeled Routine Review tucked beneath a stack of overpriced Williams-Sonoma napkins. It was not a schedule for the children. It was a comprehensive $115,000 Small Business Administration loan application for Melissa's failing luxury boutique, a vanity project that specialized in $60 artisanal candles and imported Italian silk scarves that nobody in this zip code actually needed. My breath hitched in my throat as I scanned the documents, my eyes locking onto the section for the primary guarantor where my name, Emily Sarah Miller, was printed in bold, official font. My pulse hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I realized she had cited my active-duty military housing allowance and my federal life insurance policy as collateral for her plummeting business venture. She had forged my digital signature with a chilling level of calculated precision, likely using the simple power of attorney and family emergency forms I had signed for her years ago when I was first deployed to the Middle East and foolishly believed I needed a trusted point of contact back home. The document, dated only 3 weeks ago, laid out a grim financial reality where her boutique was hemorrhaging nearly $9,000 a month in commercial rent and inventory costs. Yet the application claimed a steady stream of projected income backed by my own government-guaranteed salary. I stood there in my scuffed boots on her $200 per square foot marble flooring, feeling the sheer weight of a decade of service being auctioned off to save a sinking ship I never agreed to board. The cold irony of the situation was a physical weight. While I was managing million-dollar logistics chains in the Air Force, my own sister was treats my identity as a disposable resource to be harvested for her suburban fantasies. The digital signature looked hauntingly like my own, a perfect replica of the hurried scrawl I used on flight manifests and equipment requisitions, but it represented a total collapse of the sibling bond one had spent my life trying to protect. My military housing allowance, the BH that was supposed to provide me with a sense of security and a future home, was being leveraged to pay for her boutique's overpriced storefront in a high-end shopping district. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the extent of the premeditation required to pull this off. The way she must have sat at her mahogany desk, perhaps sipping a glass of expensive Napa Valley Cabernet, while she systematically dismantled my financial future to cover for her own incompetence. The house around me, with its soaring ceilings and expensive crown molding, suddenly felt like a tomb built with the bricks of my own hard work and stolen credit. I looked at the clock again, the red numbers glowing 7:16 p.m., and realized that while Melissa was currently lounging on a white sand beach in the Maldives, sipping a $30 cocktail paid for by a husband who likely knew nothing of this fraud, I was standing in the wreckage of my trust. Every favor she had ever asked, every time she had called me crying about a family crisis, flashed before my eyes as a series of tactical maneuvers designed to keep me close enough to exploit but distant enough to never ask questions. She didn't want a sister. She wanted a silent partner with a steady federal paycheck and a sense of duty that could be weaponized against itself. I tucked the file back into the drawer, my hands steady with the cold, detached professionalism I had learned in the service. But inside, the fire of 1,000 suns was beginning to burn through the last remnants of my loyalty. I was a logistics officer trained to identify threats and neutralize supply chain disruptions, and I realized in that moment that my own sister was the greatest security breach I had ever encountered. The mission had changed from a favor to a recovery operation, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to follow the orders of the Miller family matriarchy. I sat on the edge of the guest bed at 2:44 a.m., the room smelling like stale lavender and that cloying, expensive fabric softener Melissa buys in bulk from the organic co-op in downtown Greenwich. The digital clock on the bedside table cast a dim rhythmic red glow against the eggshell white walls, marking each second of a night that had stripped away the final layers of my familial delusions. I did not cry because my training as an Air Force logistics officer does not allow for leaks, whether they are in a fuel line on a C-130 Hercules or in the emotional infrastructure of my own mind. In the military, you learn that tears are a luxury of the protected, and I have spent my entire adult life being the protector for people who would never dream of standing watch for me. As I stared at the shadows stretching across the high-pile wool rug, a realization settled into my bones with the freezing clarity of a high-altitude jump. My family did not miss Emily, the woman who had spent birthdays in sandstorms and missed Christmases to ensure cargo reached its destination. They missed the safety net. To them, I was not a person with desires, exhaustion, or a future of my own, but rather a structural support beam that they could lean on until I snapped, and then complain about the noise of the break. I picked up my phone, the screen brightness searing my retinas in the dark room, and looked at the latest photo Melissa had posted to her Instagram story 3 hours ago. There she was, glowing under the Maldivian sun at a resort that costs $2,400 a night, casually sipping a $16 Mai Tai garnished with a dehydrated pineapple slice and a tiny silk umbrella. Her caption read, "Much needed mama break," a phrase that felt like a slap in the face given that she was currently funding this break by forging my signature on a $115,000 SBA loan application. While I was expected to sit here in her suburban fortress, changing the diapers of her toddlers and adhering to a micromanaged schedule of organic snacks and Mandarin lessons, she was effectively auctioning off my military housing allowance to pay for her bankrupt dreams of being a boutique mogul. The sheer predatory nature of her entitlement was staggering. She expected me to be the silent guarantor of her failures while I wore issued boots and saved every penny of my $5,600 base pay. The decision I reached in the silence of that guest room was cold, calculated, and final, stripped of the guilt that had kept me tethered to my sister's whims for 31 years. I am a logistics officer and I know exactly how to dismantle a supply chain that has become compromised by internal theft and corruption. I realized that by allowing them to use me, I wasn't being a good sister. I was being a willing victim in a long con run by my own blood. My parents' voices echoed in my head, always reminding me how strong I was, which I now understood was just code for, "You can take the abuse so Melissa doesn't have to." The injustice of it burned with a low blue flame in my chest, replacing the exhaustion of the flight with a sharp tactical focus. I didn't need to scream or throw the expensive porcelain lamps at the walls. I simply needed to exert the authority I had earned through a decade of service. I looked at the Toomey luggage stand in the corner and then at the folder in the kitchen drawer downstairs, knowing that by sunrise the Emily they knew, the one who always said yes and always opened her wallet, would be dead. I was no longer a concierge or a safety net. I was an officer dealing with a major security breach, and the recovery operation was about to begin with a precision Melissa could never imagine. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and I realized I was currently in a house full of strangers who just happened to share my last name. I did not reach out to a sympathetic friend or a local relative who would only offer platitudes and excuses for Melissa's behavior. Instead, I dialed a secure, encrypted line at exactly 9 a.m. to speak with Captain Sarah Vance, a razor-sharp military JAG lawyer and a trusted colleague I have known for 8 years since our first grueling tour together. We spoke with the clipped, efficient cadence of officers who understand that emotion is a secondary concern to the integrity of the mission, and within minutes the framework for my counter-operation was in place. I spent what was supposed to be my relaxing vacation in Greenwich not lounging by the heated infinity pool or sampling the local $28 lobster rolls, but instead meticulously gathering 48 months of bank statements, detailed IP login logs from the specific Tuesday the Small Business Administration loan was digitally signed, and notarized affidavits that proved I was on duty at Travis Air Force Base during every key signature window. I treated the mahogany dining room table like a tactical operations center, systematically cross-referencing Melissa's boutique expenses with the unauthorized withdrawals from our shared, emergency family account that I had funded with my own blood and sweat. My arsenal was no longer just my rank or my resilience, but a 4-pound manila folder filled with cold, hard felony evidence that documented a systematic pattern of identity theft and financial fraud. I traced the digital breadcrumbs she had left behind with the arrogance of someone who assumed I was too distracted by my service to notice the missing thousands or the leveraged collateral. I secured records from the local branch of J.P. Morgan Chase where she had presented her forged power of attorney, and I even managed to pull the surveillance timestamps from the day she accessed the safety deposit box where I kept my secondary military ID. Every document I added to the stack was a nail in the coffin of our relationship. Yet I felt a strange, icy calm as the pile grew, realizing that I was finally speaking a language that Melissa and my parents would have no choice but to understand. By the third day of her Maldives trip, while she was likely posting photos of a 7-course sunset dinner, I was finalizing a comprehensive report for the Office of the Inspector General and preparing a formal police report for the Greenwich Police Department. I had documented the exact $300 transactions at upscale spas that had been billed to my credit card under the guise of household expenses, and I had the ironclad proof that the digital signature on the $115,000 loan had been executed from her home IP address while I was 3,000 miles away in California. There was no room for interpretation or the family-first gaslighting that I knew my parents would eventually attempt. There were only the facts, presented with the clinical precision of a logistics manifest. I looked at the folder sitting on the kitchen island, its weight representing the absolute end of my role as the Miller family's silent benefactor and the beginning of my life as a woman who finally realized that loyalty without reciprocity is just a form of slow-motion suicide. The quiet of the house no longer felt oppressive but rather like the moments of silence before an artillery strike, and as I checked the time on my Garmin Tactics watch, I knew that the window for Melissa's easy life was rapidly closing. I was an Air Force logistics officer, and I had just successfully rerouted the consequences of her actions directly back to her front door with a signature-required delivery. Melissa and her husband Mark returned on Sunday evening with the triumphant air of conquerors, their skin sunburnt to a painful shade of coral and smelling of expensive La Roche-Posay SPF 50 that lingered in the entryway like a chemical shroud. Without a single word of genuine thanks for my week of labor, they immediately pivoted into host mode, inviting 12 of their wealthiest neighbors over for an impromptu welcome-home barbecue that felt more like a staged production than a social gathering. I stood by the sliding glass doors of the patio, watching Mark flip 24 premium Wagyu burgers on a $3,000 Lynx professional grill while $300 worth of craft beer from a local microbrewery sat chilling in a galvanized steel tub filled with artisanal ice. Melissa was in her element, flitting between guests in a new $450 Zimmermann linen dress, her laughter ringing out like shattered glass as she told everyone how brave I was for serving in the Air Force, using my sacrifice as a conversational prop to boost her own social standing. It was a sickening display of performative affection. She would squeeze my arm and tell a story about my last deployment to a captive audience of hedge fund managers and their wives, all while I knew she was secretly calculating how to use my compromised credit to secure a lease on a new 2024 Range Rover autobiography. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the air, thicker than the smoke rising from the grill, as I realized she was effectively celebrating her successful theft of my financial future with the very people she hoped to impress with her fabricated wealth. Every time she mentioned my rank or my duty, I felt the cold manila folder upstairs in my Toomey bag pulse with a life of its own, a silent witness to the felony fraud she had committed while I was thousands of miles away defending the very freedoms she used to exploit me. The neighbors, sipping their chilled IPAs and nodding with practiced empathy, had no idea that the woman they were praising for her family values had spent the last 72 hours being investigated by a military JAG officer and the local authorities. I watched Melissa's husband laugh at a joke about interest rates, his teeth white against his tan, and I wondered if he was a co-conspirator or just another victim of Melissa's pathological need to maintain an image of suburban perfection at any cost. The contrast between my life of MREs and flight lines and this world of Wagyu and $300 beer was finally reaching its breaking point, and the sheer audacity of her hosting a party while my identity was being auctioned off to save her failing boutique was the final catalyst I needed. As the sun began to dip below the meticulously pruned tree-line of their Greenwich estate, casting long dramatic shadows across the designer patio furniture, Melissa caught my eye and blew me a kiss, a gesture so hollow and manipulative that it made my skin crawl. She truly believed she had gotten away with it, that her quiet, dutiful little sister would never have the backbone to challenge the queen of the cul-de-sac. But she had forgotten one fundamental truth about my profession. A logistics officer does not just move supplies. We identify vulnerabilities, we calculate risks, and we execute strikes with absolute precision. The party continued around me, a whirlwind of shallow compliments and expensive consumerism, but I remained centered in my cold, tactical silence, knowing that the brave sister she was so proud to show off was about to deliver a cargo of consequences that no amount of craft beer or Wagyu beef could ever soften. The mission was no longer about family. It was about the total restoration of my integrity, and as the clock ticked toward the end of the evening, I felt the satisfying click of the final piece of my counteroperation falling into place. I waited until the sun had dipped below the line of meticulously manicured arborvitae and the first celebratory toasts began to echo across the bluestone patio before I made my move. I did not scream or cause a scene that could be dismissed as a hysterical outburst. Instead, I maintained the cold, detached composure of a commanding officer overseeing a tactical briefing as I stepped into the center of the gathering. With a steady hand, I began distributing 15 identical professionally bound packets to the neighbors and family members who were currently balancing expensive drinks and small talk. Since Melissa loves sharing my personal resources so much, I thought you would all like to see her latest and most ambitious project, I said, my voice cutting through the evening air with a level of authority that silenced the clinking of silverware and the low hum of suburban gossip. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to swallow the flickering candlelight and the smell of charred Wagyu beef as the guests began to flip through the pages I had provided. My father, Jerry, stood frozen near the high-end Lynx grill, the shock of the first page causing him to lose his grip on a $12 white porcelain plate that shattered against the patio stones with a sharp final crack. The neighbors, people who spent their lives obsessing over credit scores and social standing, stared down at the copies of the $115,000 SBA loan application and the forensic evidence of the forged digital signatures I had compiled. I watched as their eyes moved from the official government headers to the specific sections where my military housing allowance and federal life insurance had been leveraged as collateral for a failing boutique. Melissa's face transformed from a vibrant sunburnt tan to a ghostly, sickly white in exactly 3.5 seconds. Her glass of chilled Chardonnay trembling in her hand until a few drops spilled onto her $450 Zimmermann dress. The hyperrealistic details of her fraud were laid bare in black and white. The IP addresses traced to her home office, the timestamps coinciding with my deployment half a world away, and the desperate financial ledgers showing her business was hemorrhaging $9,000 a month. I stood there in my issued boots, a stark contrast to the sea of Italian leather loafers and designer sandals, feeling the absolute collapse of the facade she had spent years constructing. My mother reached out to touch Melissa's arm, a reflex of protection for her golden child, but stopped mid-air as she saw the sheer weight of the felony evidence in the hands of the very people she tried to impress. The neighbors began to exchange uneasy, sidelong glances, the performative warmth of the barbecue evaporating instantly as they realized they were standing in the middle of a crime scene rather than a social event. Mark, Melissa's husband, looked down at the packet in his hands, his jaw tightening as he read the part about the unauthorized withdrawals from the family emergency fund that had been redirected to pay for Melissa's luxury vacations and spa treatments. The air felt heavy, charged with the static of 1,000 unspoken questions and the sudden brutal realization that the brave sister Melissa had been praising was actually the victim of her systematic predation. I didn't need to say another word. The documentation spoke with a clinical precision that no excuse could penetrate. I looked at Melissa, whose mouth was working but producing no sound, and I realized that the sister I had spent a decade protecting was gone, replaced by a stranger who had traded my future for a few more months of suburban pretension. The mission was complete. The security breach had been identified and exposed to the entire chain of command, and as I turned to walk away from the wreckage of her reputation, I felt the first breath of genuine freedom I had known in 31 years. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I walked toward the driveway to leave that gilded cage forever, I didn't look back at the people who had treated my life like an interest-free loan. It was just a bridge, Emily, a temporary bridge to get my business through a dry spell, and family is supposed to help family when things get tough, Melissa shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, desperate register that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of her 3,200-square-foot fortress. I stood my ground on the Italian marble foyer, looking her directly in the eye with the cold, unwavering stare I had perfected during high-stakes logistics briefings at Travis Air Force Base, and I felt the last lingering threads of my sisterly affection snap like a dry twig under a heavy boot. Family does not commit identity theft, and family certainly does not forge federal documents to leverage an active duty officer's military housing allowance and life insurance as collateral for a bankrupt vanity project, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble that commanded the silence of the entire room. I informed her with clinical precision that the Small Business Administration Fraud Department had already flagged the $115,000 application due to the discrepancies in the digital signature logs I provided, and that the military police at the nearest installation were expecting my formal sworn statement at exactly 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. My father, Jerry, stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture, his face still flushed from the shock of the broken porcelain plate, and tried to defend her by claiming we could handle this internally without ruining Melissa's life or her reputation in Greenwich. My mother hovered behind him, nodding frantically and whispering about how a criminal record would destroy the kids' chances at the private academy, proving once and for all that they valued the polished veneer of Melissa's manufactured life over my actual legal and financial survival. They didn't see the felony. They only saw the inconvenience of the truth, and their attempt to gaslight me into complicity was the final confirmation that I was nothing more than a resource to be managed rather than a daughter to be loved. I did not engage in the argument or allow them to pull me back into the cycle of emotional blackmail that had defined my 31 years of existence. Instead, I simply adjusted the strap of my tactical bag and turned toward the massive mahogany front door without uttering another word. The air outside was crisp and smelled of damp mulch and the neighboring salt air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of betrayal and expensive candles I was leaving behind for the last time. I walked down the long illuminated driveway past Mark's glistening 2024 Mercedes-Benz and climbed into the waiting black Toyota Camry that served as my $45 Uber ride to a nearby Marriott. As the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked out the rear window at the sprawling lit-up estate and realized that the luxury I had helped fund was built on a foundation of sand and lies. I am an Air Force logistics officer, and I have spent my career ensuring that resources go where they are earned and where they are needed to maintain the integrity of the mission. Tonight, I finally applied those same principles to my own life by cutting off a supply line that was being looted by the very people who were supposed to guard my rear. The weight of the 4-pound manila folder in my lap felt like a shield rather than a burden, a physical manifestation of the boundaries I should have set a decade ago when I first put on the uniform. I checked my Garmin watch, noting the steady rhythm of my heart rate returning to a baseline of 72 beats per minute, and I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me as the suburban lights of Greenwich faded into the distance. Family is not defined by shared DNA or the names on a birth certificate. Family is the group of people who stand by you with honor and respect, and I was finally ready to stop being the safety net for a family that never intended to catch me if I fell. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in my life, I was the one behind the wheel of my own destiny, and no forged signature or shrieking plea for loyalty was ever going to steer me off course again. This was not a betrayal of my family. It was a long overdue act of justice for the woman who had sacrificed everything for people who viewed her sacrifice as their birthright. The fallout was surgical, a clinical deconstruction of a life built on a foundation of stolen credit and suburban artifice that I executed with the cold precision of a high-level logistics extraction. Once my sworn statement reached the Small Business Administration Fraud Department and the local authorities, the $115,000 loan application was not just canceled, it triggered a massive, deep-dive audit of Melissa's boutique that stripped away every layer of her financial deception. Within 60 days, the carefully curated image of the Greenwich socialite collapsed as she was forced to list her 3,200-square-foot fortress for $890,000, a fire sale price intended to cover the mountain of existing debts and high-interest bridge loans she had hidden from Mark and our parents. I watched from 2,800 miles away as the house that had been a monument to her entitlement was emptied of its designer furniture and Jo Malone candles, replaced by the hollow echo of a failed ambition. My parents, who had spent decades enabling her every whim while expecting me to be the silent pillar of the family, lost their peaceful retirement in an instant because they were forced to co-sign her new lease and liquidate their modest savings to keep her out of a federal courtroom. They moved from their comfortable life into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a deteriorating section of Bridgeport where the air smelled of exhaust and industrial gray instead of manicured lawns and sea salt. The irony was a jagged pill for them to swallow. The golden child they had protected at my expense had finally become the anchor that dragged their golden years into the dirt. My father's emails changed from demanding favors to pleading for a phone call, but I maintained the radio silence I had established the night I walked out to that $45 Uber. I am an Air Force logistics officer, and I know that once a supply line is compromised beyond repair, you do not throw good resources after bad. You cut the connection and reroute your energy toward a mission that actually yields a return. Melissa's boutique, the vanity project that had started this cascade of ruin, was shuttered by a court-ordered liquidation sale where her $60 artisanal candles were sold for pennies on the dollar to strangers who didn't care about her vision. She now spends her days navigating the reality of a 9-to-5 job she is wholly unqualified for, wearing off-brand clothes because her $210 Lululemon sets were among the first things she had to sell on luxury resale sites to buy groceries. The brave sister she used to mock is now the only member of the family with a stable future, a clean credit report, and a soul that isn't weighed down by the parasitic needs of people who view love as a transaction. I sit in my modest officer's housing at Travis Air Force Base, looking at the sunset over the flight line, and I feel a profound, quiet peace that I never could have achieved while playing the role of the family safety net. The lesson I learned in the wreckage of Melissa's life is one they don't teach in basic training. Family isn't blood, family is the group of people who stay when the truth comes out and the money runs dry. I have found my real family in the men and women I serve with, people who understand the value of a promise and the necessity of integrity in the face of a crisis. My credit is secure, my career is thriving, and for the first time in 31 years, my name belongs to me and me alone. As the sound of a C-5 Galaxy taking off rumbles through my living room, I realized that the most successful logistics operation I ever conducted was the one where I moved myself out of the reach of people who only knew how to take. The bridge Melissa tried to build with my future has been burned to the ground, and in its place, I have built a fortress of my own, one made of self-respect, hard-earned boundaries, and the absolute certainty that I will never again be a silent guarantor for someone else's lies. I received 14 frantic emails from my mother over the span of a single 48-hour period, each one more unhinged and manipulative than the last as she systematically tried to blame me for destroying the family dynamic that she had spent decades curating at my expense. Her words arrived in my inbox like shrapnel, accusing me of being cold, heartless, and ungrateful for a family that supposedly gave me everything, while she conveniently ignored the $115,000 in forged debt Melissa had tried to anchor to my soul. I read her desperate pleas for me to drop the charges and pay off the remaining boutique creditors, a request that would have cost me every cent of my hard-earned $5,600 base pay for the next 3 years, and I felt a strange clinical detachment from the woman who had once been my primary moral compass. I did not engage in the emotional gymnastics or the guilt-tripping narratives she tried to weave. Instead, I drafted a single final reply and included a CC to Captain Sarah Vance, my JAG lawyer, ensuring that every word was documented for the ongoing federal investigation. Our family dynamic was not based on love or mutual support, it was based on systemic financial theft and the exploitation of my service, I wrote, my fingers steady on the keyboard of my government-issued laptop as I watched the sun set over the Travis Air Force Base flight line. I informed her with absolute finality that the boutique was closed, the SBA fraud case was out of my hands, and that any further attempts to contact me regarding Melissa's self-inflicted ruin would be forwarded directly to legal counsel as harassment. Once the send button was clicked, I systematically went through my iPhone and blocked every single number associated with the Miller name, from my father's cell to the landline in their new, cramped two-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a profound and necessary barrier that I had finally earned after 10 years of being their unpaid high-end concierge and emergency fund. I then drove to the personnel office on base and filled out the paperwork to officially change my emergency contact from my next of kin to the Air Force Casualty Office, a symbolic and legal severance that ensured they would never again be notified of my movements, my health, or my location. I am no longer a backup plan for people who only remember my name when a bill is due or a luxury vacation needs a babysitter. And the realization that I am now completely untethered from their dysfunction felt like the first deep breath I had taken since I was 18 years old. The $14 MREs I had eaten in the desert and the nights I had spent sleeping on hangar floors suddenly felt like a fair trade for the independence I now possessed. A stark contrast to the 5-bedroom colonial in Greenwich that had been built on a foundation of my stolen identity. I looked at the photo of my sister sipping her $16 Mai Tai one last time before deleting my entire social media presence, erasing the digital trail that allowed them to treat my life like a spectator sport. Melissa is now living the reality she earned, navigating a world where she has to account for every dollar of her own income, while I am moving forward with a clean record, an impeccable credit score, and the respect of the only family that ever truly had my back, my fellow airmen, and the service that taught me the value of integrity. Family is not blood, it is the commitment to honor and truth that survives when the gilded cages are torn down, and as I walked out of the personnel office into the cool evening air, I knew that the mission of reclaiming my life was finally, irrevocably complete. I am Emily Miller, an Air Force logistics officer, and I am finally the only person who holds the keys to my future, a future that no longer includes being a safety net for people who never intended to catch me. 6 months have passed since the surgical extraction of my life from the wreckage of the Miller family dynamic, and I now wake up to the crisp, bracing air of Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where the view of the Rhineland-Palatinate forest replaces the suffocating, artificial perfection of suburban Connecticut. My financial landscape is a fortress of my own making, with my primary savings account holding the remains of my $5,600 monthly base pay that is no longer being siphoned off to fund $60 candles or luxury beach getaways. My credit score has climbed to a pristine, untouchable 820, a silent testament to the thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt I successfully cleared with the help of Captain Sarah Vance and the Small Business Administration's Criminal Investigation Unit. Instead of spending my holiday leave scrubbing Melissa's white oak floors or managing her toddler's hyperspecific Mandarin immersion schedule, I spent my Christmas hiking the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Bavarian Alps, wearing high-performance mammoth gear that I purchased with my own honest earnings. The silence of the mountains was a sanctuary compared to the shrill, entitled shrieks of my sister and the gaslighting whispers of my parents who once tried to convince me that my identity was a communal resource. While Melissa now navigates the gritty reality of a 2-bedroom apartment in a deteriorating section of Bridgeport and a job that requires her to actually be accountable for her own mistakes, I am coordinating complex multinational logistics chains across Europe with a level of clarity I never knew I possessed. I have replaced the stale lavender scent of her guest room with the smell of pine needles, fresh snow, and the ozone that lingers after a winter storm, a sensory shift that marks the total restoration of my autonomy. Every step I took on those alpine trails felt like a physical shedding of the $1,200 commercial flight tickets and the forged signatures that had once threatened to bury my future under a mountain of her domestic drama. Before I officially transitioned into this new chapter of my career, I sat in a small cafe in Garmisch-Partenkirchen and wrote out one final postcard to the new, cramped address where my parents now live as a direct consequence of their own enabling. The card featured a sweeping panoramic view of the Zugspitze, a landscape so vast and uncompromising that it made their suburban squabbles look like grains of sand in a desert. I did not include a return address, nor did I provide a phone number for them to call when the next bill comes due or when Melissa's next business venture inevitably collapses under the weight of her own incompetence. I simply wrote 4 words in the steady, disciplined hand of an officer who has finally secured the perimeter of her own soul. I am finally home. This message was not an invitation for reconciliation or a plea for understanding. It was a final status report, a notification that the person they used to exploit no longer exists in their jurisdiction. I am no longer a safety net, a concierge, or a silent guarantor for a family that viewed my strength as an invitation for abuse. My home is no longer a physical structure tied to a zip code in Greenwich or a duty station in California. It is the state of existing without the shadow of their expectations looming over my bank account. As I watched the postman take the card, I felt the last lingering weight of the Miller family legacy evaporate into the freezing mountain air. I am Emily Miller, a logistics officer for the United States Air Force, and for the first time in 31 years, I am exactly where I am supposed to be, surrounded by a family of choice that values honor over artifice and truth over convenience. The mission is closed, the assets are secured, and I am finally living a life that no one else can sign for. Revenge is not always a loud, cinematic explosion that levels everything in its path. Sometimes, it is the quiet, heavy, and incredibly satisfying clicking of a lock that you finally own, a sound that signals the definitive end of an era of exploitation. I have learned through the hardest and most expensive lessons of my 31 years that you simply cannot save people who do not view you as a human being, but rather as a permanent life raft they fully intend to sink once they have reached their next destination of convenience. For a decade, I operated under the delusion that my strength as an Air Force logistics officer was meant to be the foundation for my sister Melissa's fragile ego and my parents' selective blindness. But I eventually realized that every dollar of my $5,600 base pay I gave away was just another plank she would use to build a pyre for my own future. The hyperrealistic clarity of my current life in Germany is a stark, beautiful contrast to the years I spent managing million-dollar military supply chains while my own personal identity was being auctioned off for a $115,000 SBA loan I never authorized. I think back to the specific weight of that 4-pound manila folder filled with felony evidence and the way it felt more like a holy relic than a legal document when I handed it out at that $300 craft beer barbecue in Greenwich. Cutting off my family was not an act of malice, but a surgical necessity to stop the hemorrhaging of my own soul and the systematic theft of the life I had earned while surviving on $14 MREs and sleeping on cold hangar floors. There is a profound, almost religious peace in knowing that my credit score is a perfect 820 and that no one in the world has the power to forge my digital signature or leverage my military housing allowance to pay for $60 artisanal candles or luxury beach getaways. I have replaced the suffocating smell of stale lavender and expensive fabric softener with the scent of alpine air and the hum of jet engines that represent a career built on merit rather than manipulation. My parents, who once viewed me as a free high-end concierge service, are now learning the true cost of their golden child, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smells of defeat. And while a part of me mourns the family I thought I had, the rest of me is too busy hiking the Bavarian Alps to look back. You cannot carry the weight of people who refuse to walk on their own 2 feet, especially when they are trying to break your legs just to make sure you stay beneath them. I have successfully rerouted my loyalty to a new chain of command consisting of people who understand that family is a bond of honor, not a blood oath to be a victim. The mission of my life is no longer about being a safety net for a sinking ship. It is about piloting my own vessel through clear, independent waters where the only person I have to answer to is the woman I see in the mirror. I am Emily Miller, and I have finally realized that the greatest logistical achievement of my career was not moving tons of equipment across a war zone, but moving myself out of a toxic dynamic that was designed to consume me whole. The bridge is burned, the perimeter is secure, and for the first time in my existence I am truly, irrevocably home.